Welcome to History Now. In today's show, I'm delighted to welcome Dr Órfhlaith Campbell here, who's going to talk to us about her recent research on the temperance movements in Ireland. Órfhlaith, you're very welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Your topic, temperance movements, really interesting. What was your motivation in getting into it?
It's actually a strange story. I actually had just applied to do for my PGCE, and I went to a lecturer that had been very good to me in Korean, and she said to me at the time, great that you're doing a PGCE, but why don't you do your PhD? Here's this opportunity here. For my master's, I had looked at Ballycastle in the First World War. So when this temperance opportunity came up between the Irish Temperance League and the Open University, that was what I originally wanted to study, to look at temperance during the war, because in my Ballycastle in the First World War research project for my master's, I had came across a story of my great-grandfather and his brother who were home on leave, and they got arrested for drunken disorderly behaviour. Their youngest brother James had been killed in France. So I suppose, unbeknownst to me at the time, it was actually the link between trauma and drug use as self-medication that had got me interested in this. But when I started looking at the archives of the ITL and the historiography of the Irish Temperance Movement, I realised that it was really segregated, and it predominantly looked at the Catholic movement. So it focused very much on Father Matthew in the 30s and 40s, and then the pioneers in the 80s, and there was no understanding of the holistic Irish Temperance Movement both before and after, and this movement was basically everybody worked together in it. There was still religious segregation. So before any thematic approach to Irish temperance, such as Irish temperance in the First World War, could have been taken, I had to fill in the blanks. Right. So that's how I got to here. Yeah,
and so you've touched upon it there, the different temperance movements.
Yeah.
So was the reason that you began, so Father Matthew is probably the most famous sort of temperance advocate in Ireland, Irish history. Your work comes in just after him, so that was a deliberate thing to fill in the blanks?
Absolutely. So 1858 is the start of the ITL. I had to look at what's happening before that. So the ITL is the Irish Temperance League. So Father Matthew obviously is a very big part of that. Some historians think he is the most successful of Irish temperance. I would argue that's actually not the case, that it probably is the ITL. It is the ITL who's the most successful. Father Matthew's like a flash in the pan of the bigger temperance movement. It's very intense for the few years that it lasts, but it doesn't really have any lasting significance. It's very much based around Father Matthew himself. There's a superstitious belief around him. A lot of his followers believed if they could just get to touch him, they would be cured of their disease, which was drinking. And when he goes to America during the famine, really the love for temperance in Ireland sort of fades away. Plus, during the famine, when people are struggling for food, you're not really going to be worrying about drink. Plus, beer had nutritional value, so it wouldn't have been very fair to take away a way to get some nutrition during that time. But Father Matthew did change the movement in a way. He brought it very much more in line with the working class, but Father Matthew is brought in for that reason, to bring the Catholic working class and rural poor masses into the temperance movement. By the time Father Matthew comes into it, the temperance movement is almost 10 years old in Ireland anyway. So it's not so much that it starts with him, he's brought in to bring the Catholic population into it as well.
Right. There's something interesting what you said about your own, the masters, and about trauma and self-medication. Is there any sense of, around Father Matthew's time when he goes to America that, that you said the famines there, people are suffering? Was there any sense of people getting heavily involved in alcohol then? Or?
So the temperance movement starts in Ireland in 1829, and it starts in Belfast. A priest from Donegal called Reverend Joseph Penny, he's a returned immigrant, so he comes back to Belfast, and he's been involved in the American temperance movement for about 3 years. And then he talks to his friend, Reverend John Edgar, and they're already starting to talk about temperance in terms of Sabbatarianism, so respecting the Sabbath and not having any inappropriate behaviours. John Edgar then loves the news of this American Temperance Society, and he replicates that in Ulster, and he forms the Ulster Temperance Society. But that's very much just anti-spirits. So spirits need to be avoided and drunkenness is avoided. All other forms of alcohol are fine. But that's really based on this idea that drunkards, as they were called at the time, people suffering from alcohol, that they were beyond redemption, that they couldn't be saved. They've already given into a life of sin. Father Matthew then starts to change that and say, no, hold on, they can't be saved. Everybody just needs to give up all drink. So it changes from moderation for anti-spirits to total abstinence. The ITL come along and they say, well, no, actually, yes, we can, drunkards can be saved, but everybody needs to be abstinent through all drink. But the belief really is coming from a belief in a moral feeling of the working class, that they were just inherently morally and intellectually weaker. There was no understanding of how trauma was driving demand for drink at the time. So nobody was really talking about the working conditions, poverty, sanitary conditions, long working hours, the conditions that they were working in. Nobody's really taken an understanding of how that trauma was fueling demand for alcohol.
Yeah. So the main body, the main organisation that you're looking at, what would their makeup, in terms of the people who were organising it?
So it was predominantly Protestant, so Presbyterian businessmen from Ulster. But the Irish Temperance League did have an all-Ireland reach. So by 1912 they have, I think it's 412 affiliated societies throughout Ireland. So, and it's in 27 counties. So it is an all-Ireland movement, but they predominantly use the networks of Protestant religions around the country. It would have been sort of the local elite. So you had Hugh Hanna, who was in it, William Johnson of the Orange Order, Alexander S. Meehan, who owned a tract depository shop in Waring Street. He was one of the main founders of the movement. John Redmond would have also been involved in helping out the ITL as well, worked in connection with them, again, as the century goes on, to try and bring the Catholic population back into it, because really until the pioneers in 1890, there's not really any organised temperance movement for the Catholic population here.
So with this Irish temperance movement in the 1850s, mm-hmm. Is there any sense of how they viewed Father Matthew's movement, or was there any continuity?
Absolutely. So that's very much what I argue in my research, is that there is continuity throughout the whole temperance movement. So when the ITL is formed in 1858, that is to formalise and organise the Prohibition movement in Ireland. But these men have been involved from the temperance movement in Ireland from 1826. So Meehan, Alexander S. Meehan, Johnson, James Houghton, I can never say his name, they're all either involved in the Ulster Temperance Society or Father Matthew. And the Irish Temperance League really, they learn over this 30-year period, and they see what worked. So they So the Ulster Temperance Society was quite elitist, so they used journals and high-end arguments and soirees and networking with the rich businessmen in the area. Father Matthew changes that, and he puts entertainment evenings, he has lectures, he uses medals and the pledge to really reach a more illiterate working class and rural poor. So the ITL incorporate all of that. Although they disagree fundamentally with John Edgar that moderation is the way to go, and they disagree with certain parts of Father Matthew's crusade as well, they still very much see them as the fathers of Irish temperance and do really want to emulate what they were trying to do, even though they say there is a better way to do. There's a more efficient way to do it, and they really organise the movement. So even that when I start in 1858, it is to get prohibition in Ireland. It's not. It's learning from the previous 30 years and everything that happened.
Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple of things there, but really, in what way did this organisation reach, the urban and the rural poor? What tactics did they use?
So the ITL is interesting because up until the early 50s, moral suasion is really what is used to reach society, to try and get the temperance ideas out there. Legislative prohibition starts to come into it, but it's really split between total abstinence and moderation. The ITL build this really big organisation that is 100% focused on total abstinence, and they have two sections to their organisation. So one is moral suasion and one is legislative. Most historians to date have thought that Ulster Protestant temperance only focused on legislation. That that's not true. They had a significant moral suasion department as well, and this department had a dual strategy. So they have a high-end strategy which is pretty common for 19th century philanthropic organisations. You know, it's fundraising, it's, as I said, soirees, you know, they're having big annual dinners with the best of the best in town to raise money and networking and such as. They also have an outreach strategy, which is like their lower level strategy, and that primarily focuses on the provision of education. So they have two ways that they do that. They have a travelling agent at all times that travels all around Ireland, and they have a journal. So again, the journal is perhaps more literate arguments, reaching to more of an elite market, and then their travelling agent would have been doing talks in towns and villages all around Ireland. So they have education, they have lifestyle support. So the ITL form the first coffee business in Belfast. They had a very successful high-end coffee shop in Lombard Street, and that was really the social function of the temperance community. They also had coffee kiosks in every working class thoroughfare in the city, and that's really the idea. Then men going to work could grab a coffee instead of grabbing a beer. They opened these all around Ireland as well, and that's, I think by the 90s they have officially formed a for-profit business that funds their non-profit organisation. As well as that, they work on prevention, so that primarily focuses on women and children. So the thinking being that women were like the moral guardians of family, so they had a moral duty to influence their family to stay away from alcohol. The Temperance League is also very supportive of women's suffrage. It is kind of progressive in a way, but also they're kind of using them in a way because the thinking being, if the woman is the moral guardian of the home and if she goes and votes for Prohibition, then she will guide the rest of her household to do so. Children primarily focused on the Band of Hope, and that was started by a lady from, I believe Anne Carline was from Dublin, but she started the Band of Hope in Leeds in 47, and that was the thinking being, if we raise children within the teaching of Prohibition ideology, then drink will just eradicate from society. So that was their main two preventative methods. They also focus quite a lot on recovery. Now, recovery isn't a substantial piece of work as the other three that I just mentioned, but they do use their networks that they've built up with businessmen and politicians and the state to really push for the idea that drunkards, as alcoholics, or those suffering with substance use disorders at the time, that they wouldn't continue with this circle of sin and punishment, because they really believed that this wasn't helping anybody. You were just continuing to reinforce trauma that these people were suffering. There's a reformatory in Ennis in County Clare, and I think by the turn of the century there was like 100 men and women from Belfast who had been sent to Ennis for treatment from addiction, and the ITL were commended for supporting these men and women. When they came back into Belfast, they helped get them homes and they helped get them jobs, and stay in those jobs and homes by living a total abstinence lifestyle.
So one particular person who features in your work quite a bit is a man called John Hawkins. Could you tell us a bit about him?
Yeah, so John Hawkins was a reformed drunk from Liverpool who comes to Ireland in 1848, I believe it is. In England, you would find working class would have been quite empowering in the total abstinence movement by themselves. So temperance starts in Ulster in 1829 and it's moderation. It quickly moves to England and becomes total abstinence. The thinking being, you can't ask the working class to give up their drink while the middle class still has theirs. And working class communities in England latch onto this quite quickly. It doesn't have the same effect in Ireland. Nobody, the working classes aren't really listening to it at all. Drink has quite a cultural place within Irish society. So you find it's the middle class temperance reformers who bring John Hawkins to Ireland in order to do a tour. But this is quite a progressive idea at the time, because up until that, like I said, you had John Edgar who's saying drunks can't be saved. Drunkenness is a sin, it's in the Bible. Once you've submitted to that life, there's no possible way that you can have redemption or personal salvation. And he actually says, it's quite a cruel quote, he was like, forget about the spirits movement, it'll be buried in the graves with the drunkards. So basically they're just all going to die out. So John Hawkins is took to Ireland to do a tour of Ireland to bring the working classes into the temperance movement. It does have some success, but it's predominantly with Protestant working class, and that's then why Father Matthew is brought in to attract it to the the Catholic working class. Sorry.
As you've mentioned, there's Catholic involvement through the churches, there's Protestant involvement through their churches. Is it harmonised, or is there any conflict between the two of them in what their approach is?
So there's a little bit of both. One of the reasons why I enjoyed temperance so much was because it was an alternative lens to look at this period in Irish history with. So temperance is holistic because, as I said, the founders of the Irish Temperance League really take John Edgar and Father Matthew and Protestant and Catholic, it's all seen as one together, but the churches really stay away from the temperance movement. The Catholic Church stays away from it until the 1890s. They really don't support Father Matthew at all and are really actually concerned with this superstitious element that forms around him. There is a belief that Protestant temperance is formed out of the Presbyterian Church. That's also not true. Temperance is formed as a reaction to what reformers, they don't think the church is doing enough to help it. So there's actually much more tension between temperance and all church establishments in Ireland, but it is interesting because you have, like I said, figures like Hugh Hannah and William Johnson who are involved in this, and within the temperance movement they are actually kind of the voice of reason in a way. There's this really interesting Bible wine issue that develops around St Enoch's Church, which Hugh Hannah is moderator of at the time, and the belief, it's an argument over if it says fruit of the vine or fruit of the wine in the Bible. So you have half the church who will take the sacrament and half the church who won't because there's alcohol in it, and they really start arguing, and Hugh Hannah has been like, oh, we need to be balanced approach here, and we can't have this fiery argument. You also have this other interesting debate one night where, so when it gets into politics, the temperance movement, to avoid the rest of the political situation that's happening in Ireland, they will endorse any candidate regardless of what party they're from, as long as they have a temperance message. So there is a member of the Orange Order who is very angered at this, that they are supporting a nationalist MP, and he starts to shout in the middle of a meeting, "No surrender." So William Johnson, who is sort of also renowned at this time for fueling sectarian divisions in the city, he calls him out and he says, you can't be saying things like that, we have to support anybody. So temperance, it's its own little bubble, but that is also part of the reason why it fails, because you can't ignore what's happening in the rest throughout Ireland at this time. And even though all these men would sit and women would sit in a hall together trying to argue that temperance was the platform that they could all unite on, once they left that hall, it was very hard to keep that message. And even I think it's Marriott Dalloway and Johnson, who were, Dalloway was president of the ITL for 20-something years. In their election campaigns in the 90s, they can't even mention temperance at all, because it's really having no impact in comparison to the political strife that's happening in the country. Okay.
You mentioned something about it briefly at the beginning. So in relation to temperance movements and prohibition, probably the general public, myself included, automatically think of America. Were there a lot of links between America and the Irish Temperance Movement? Yeah,
so when the Irish Temperance Movement starts here in 1829 as the Ulster Temperance Society, it is founded and copies the American Temperance Society, which was started in 1826 by Dr Lyman Beecher. And John Edgar, after reading the work from the American Temperance Society, he opens the windows of his parlour and he gets all his whiskey and spirits and pours them out into the street, and he was like, that's it, this movement has been started here. He takes all the writings from the American Temperance Society and reprints them here, and that really does start a relationship between Irish temperance and American temperance. Irish temperance, American temperance and British temperance, it's all one big movement at this stage. The diaspora also play an important role in this. So when you have the Maine law in America in 1821, which was prohibition in the state of Maine, temperance reformers in both places are very much talking to each other, they're communicating with each other, they're talking about the pros and cons, but you also see it coming in just in like family documents. There's this one cousin and she writes home to her cousin here, she's in Philadelphia, and she's like, it's not really having any impact, the newspapers are sort of blowing it up, but in reality Prohibition isn't really doing anything here. Irish temperance is very much connected with the temperance movement in America at the time.
Okay. So on the topic of America, you spent time in Canada yourself. You were living there for a while, and you wrote an article on the perceptions of Irish and alcohol in American Canada. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, so Vancouver was a very interesting place to move to because it does not have the historically same Irish community that you would find in places like Philadelphia, Boston or New York. It's only really starting to grow there within the last 3 or 4 years. There's a longer Irish population out there, but it's only really growing to a big extent now. But so within that, you're having the same arguments that would have been had in like the 19th century. So you have not the older ones, but an older group of Irish immigrants to Vancouver who went out in the last maybe 10, 15, 20 years, and they went there predominantly for work. But in the last 3, 4, 5 years, you have a lot of younger ones who are coming out, or who are predominantly coming out for experience. So a lot of these would be the J1 students who would have traditionally went to America. They're now coming to Vancouver. So you have those two sort of stereotypes of Irish people as the worker and the drinker. And it was interesting, the arguments started up amongst the Irish community in themselves, but that really started to affect our relationship with landlords and employers, and it wasn't maybe as bad as you would have got obviously in the 19th century, but these comments were made, and they were made to me as well, you drink too much, you fight too much, and that sort of thing. And I came across this caution to immigrants that had been wrote in New York in 1852, and it said something like, anywhere where you're to find rowdy behaviour or fighting or drinking, there's Irish people surely to be involved. And it was interesting to watch that start to develop in Vancouver, like in a contemporary setting today. And as one of the main things when I tell everybody that what my research is, they always go, "Oh my God, there's Irish people who didn't drink." So it was interesting to watch those similarities start to develop again, and then try to navigate a way out of that.
And a lot of what you do and what you're focusing on now is addiction in the contemporary world. Do you see a lot of similarities between alcohol addiction and different types of alcohol addiction back then and different types of addiction now?
So what I'm trying to do at the minute is show how Prohibition now is the same as Prohibition was then, and why the system now is not fit for purpose. It wasn't even fit for purpose back then. So we don't get Prohibition in Ireland because it's seen as an infringement in personal liberties. The idea that there's something morally wrong with a recreational drink really was contested at the time. Again, going back to the link between religion and temperance, it's really in Ireland, the ITL who changed that. So the sin before was drunkenness. ITL and Prohibitionists really changed that to the sin being moderation. But people very much argue against that, and we don't bring it in here. So again, coming back to that link with American temperance and Prohibition, it's not until America brings in their prohibition of American prohibition for alcohol fails in the 20s and 30s, but then the prohibition of cannabis comes in quite quickly in the 30s. But as much as Prohibition here is based on class discrimination, Prohibition in America is based on racism, and focusing on supply does not eradicate demand. The belief that moderation or recreational drinking was being copied by the working class because they were morally or intellectually weaker. So even though temperance reformers were arguing that that alcoholism was a disease, it was still based on that belief that that first choice to take a drink is what ultimately made you end up as an alcoholic. We now use that argument for people who use drug use or people who are suffering from substance use disorder. Prohibition has failed. This is talked about widely around the world. Portugal brought in, tried to change their prohibition laws in 2001. They decriminalised all drugs. That led to a reduction in drug-related deaths. It led to a reduction in drug-related crime, and it didn't increase drug use across the board. Canada legalised cannabis. Parts of the States have legalised cannabis. Mexico has. Thailand just legalised homegrown. You have countries like New Zealand who are doing research into the medical benefits of MDMA. There's also a growing body of research on the benefits of microdosing magic mushrooms. So we know now that the war on drugs failed and that there's pros and cons. So I believe we need to start having that conversation here, especially because we are a post-conflict society that has a high level of trauma, and we know that trauma feeds addiction. But I think people are scared of that conversation here, so it could be a while before we are at the stage where we need it to be. But I think in the meantime, what we need to do first is primarily focus on harm reduction, so that we're stopping stigmatising people who need help. I think we need safe injection sites and safe use education out there in order to protect people.
So Órhlaith, you have all this really, really interesting research, and you're using it in a practical sense to look at today's addiction issues. Is there anything that you're going to do with this in the future?
Yep, so this year I really want to get my book out there. I believe that will be a really good start in trying to get this prohibition conversation going in Ireland. And I'm a big believer in learning from our past to inform our future. So it will give us the historical context of Irish prohibition, and hopefully allow us to understand where we are today and stop maybe just looking at our current prohibition laws as something that came from America. Yes, there was connections with it, but we have this very, very large Irish context to it as well. I've also never believed in a real top-down approach to academia, so I have recently got employment with a local homeless charity that focuses on harm reduction, so I'm really working to put my historical context to more contemporary and practical use here in Northern Ireland today.
Órhlaith, thanks very much, and I really hope you get that book out. It's a fascinating topic, and delighted you came in to talk to us about it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on. Thank you.